Living in a world of food influencers and Instagram-worthy meals, it's hilarious to think about medieval peasants rating their daily gruel. No fancy plating or foodie hashtags back then. While we stress about getting reservations at the hottest new restaurant, medieval peasants worried about having enough food to survive winter. But these folks were seriously resourceful. They had to be. When you're living off the land and every meal is a what's in my pantry challenge, you get creative. Unlike today's picky eaters who turn their nose up at slightly bruised fruit, medieval peasants used everything they could get their hands on. And I mean everything, from grinding acorns into flour when times were tough to turning weeks-old vegetables into something edible. Their eating habits tell us more than just what was on the menu. It shows how tough and adaptable people can be when they need to survive. And trust me, they needed those survival skills, especially when it came to their daily bread, which wasn't exactly the fluffy sourdough we know today, because when you might think bread is just bread, but medieval peasant bread would make modern health food fanatics cry. Forget your artisanal sourdough. Peasants were stuck with what historians call maslin bread, a mix of whatever grains they could get their hands on. And when I say whatever, I mean whatever. Recent studies of medieval bread remains found traces of peas, beans, and even ground-up tree bark. Talk about a high-fiber diet. The color wasn't exactly Instagram-worthy either. Instead of the golden brown loaves we're used to, peasant bread was often dark, dense, and about as heavy as a brick. In fact, there's a funny story from a medieval court where a peasant was actually accused of assault with a loaf of bread, and the judge believed it because these loaves were basically edible weapons. And about 80% of a medieval peasant's daily calories came from bread. That's like eating nothing but sandwiches for every meal, except without the good stuff in between. And the quality? Well, there was a reason lords got the nice white bread made from wheat, while peasants got stuck with what they called horse bread. Yes, it was so rough that it was originally meant for horses. The grain situation was pretty strict too. Peasants had to grind their grain at the lord's mill and pay for the privilege. Try skipping that rule and you'd find yourself in hot water faster than you could say artisanal bakery. Some clever peasants tried grinding their grain in secret using hand mills, but if they got caught, let's just say the punishment was more than just a slap on the wrist with a rolling pin. During bad harvests, which happened more often than not, peasants had to get creative. They'd toss in pea flour, bean flour, and sometimes even ground acorns. You know, times are tough when you're competing with squirrels for food. But here's the really interesting part. Some food historians have recreated medieval peasant bread recipes, and apparently the acorn version isn't half bad. Though I'll stick to my modern bread, thank you very much. While bread was their main meal, peasants had another trick up their sleeve for stretching their ingredients, a little something called pottage, the medieval peasants' version of everything but the kitchen sink soup. This wasn't your grandma's chicken noodle. Pottage was more like a never-ending stew that just kept evolving. You know how some people have a sourdough starter they've kept alive for years? Well, peasants did the same thing with pottage, except they keep it going for weeks or even months at a time. The daily cooking ritual went something like this. Take whatever vegetables you've got, usually peas, beans, turnips, and if you're lucky, some cabbage. Toss them in a pot with some water and let it simmer all day while you're out working in the fields. Recent archaeological findings from medieval cooking pots showed traces of everything from nettles to ferns. Talk about eating your greens. The scientists studying medieval peasant teeth found they were often healthier than modern teeth. Turns out their veggie-heavy pottage was actually pretty nutritious. Who knew? Though I bet their breath wasn't exactly minty fresh. The real genius of pottage was how it handled leftovers. Nothing went to waste. That stale bread from yesterday, toss it in. Some dried peas that have been sitting around since the last harvest, if they go. It was basically the medieval version of cleaning out your fridge before vacation, except they did it every single day. During Lent, the church said no meat allowed, but medieval peasants were masters of the loophole. They'd spot a beaver swimming in the river and say, "Hey, it spends most of its time in water. Must be a fish." Next thing you know, beaver tail pottage was on the menu. Medieval problems require medieval solutions. Am I right? But the thing about pottage, it was impossible to mess up. You literally couldn't overcook it because it was supposed to be mushy anyway. If only all cooking was that forgiving. Medieval cookbook writers didn't even bother with measurements. It was all add a handful of this or throw in whatever you've got. First-time cooks would have loved it. While pottage was the daily go-to, there was another source of food that peasants could usually count on. I'm talking about fish. And you won't believe how a medieval peasant's fishing trip was nothing like your relaxing weekend hobby. The church banned meat for almost half the year. That's about 150 days in total. But fish was fair game. Religious loopholes for the win. This rule actually saved lots of peasants from malnutrition, even if they didn't know it at the time. But the real stars of medieval waters weren't your typical fish. Eels were the medieval equivalent of fast food. Archaeological digs have found eel bones in practically every medieval trash heap. These slippery suckers were so common that some peasants actually paid their rent in eels. Imagine handing your landlord a bucket of live eels instead of cash. Records show one village had to give their lord 82,000 eels every year. Talk about a slippery situation. The fishing methods were pretty wild too. Some peasants used what they called kittles, basically giant wooden mazes built in rivers that trapped fish. Others went night fishing with spears and torches, which probably looked like some kind of medieval rave party. The really clever ones trained cormorants, those black water birds with long necks, to catch fish for them, though that was more common in Asia than Europe. One particularly hilarious fishing method involved using fermented rye dough. The fish would eat it, get drunk, and float to the surface. Medieval peasants basically invented drunk fishing, though the local lord probably wasn't too happy about them using precious grain to get fish tipsy. Rivers and streams weren't just for fishing either. They were medieval refrigerators. Peasants would store their dairy products in cool streams during summer. Sometimes they'd lose their cheese to a particularly ambitious fish, which seems like a plot from a medieval cartoon. The fish market was its own adventure. Ever wondered why fish and chip shops in England are so common? Thank medieval peasants. Fish was so important that roads from coastal towns to London were some of the first to be properly maintained, just to get fish to market faster. They even had express lanes for fish transportation. Medieval fast food delivery, if you will. Of course, if you couldn't catch fish or afford to buy them, there was always another option, though it was quite a bit riskier and involved potentially annoying some very powerful people, like I said earlier, who had strong opinions about who could hunt what, because medieval hunting laws were stricter than a helicopter parent at a teenage party. Hunting deer or boar, that was for nobles only. Even if a deer wandered into your vegetable garden and started munching on your cabbages, touching it could cost you a hand, literally. The forest laws, introduced by William the Conqueror around 1067, made huge chunks of England into royal hunting grounds. You couldn't even take a stick from these forests without permission. But peasants got creative with their interpretations of these laws. Rabbits weren't technically protected, so peasant hunting often involved elaborate rabbit traps. They'd also hunt vermin like hedgehogs and squirrels. Not exactly a feast fit for a king, but protein is protein. Recent archaeological studies of peasant garbage pits show something interesting. Lots of small animal bones mixed with bigger ones that had been carefully cracked open. Its translation: peasants were eating the marrow from every animal they could get their hands on. They were also masters of the "it fell off a cart" excuse when suspicious meat appeared in their pottage. The punishments for poaching were no joke, though. Court records from the 1300s England show that getting caught could mean anything from a massive fine to death by hanging. But some clever peasants would deliberately get caught poaching during winter. Why? Because the punishment often included free room and board in the local jail, which meant guaranteed meals during the hardest season. Talk about medieval prison food being an upgrade. Speaking of medieval jails, there's a recorded case of a group of peasants who got caught poaching a deer. Their defense? The deer had died of laughter after seeing one of them slip in the mud. Surprisingly, the judge found this so funny that he reduced their punishment. Medieval court jesters weren't the only ones with a sense of humor. Of course, when fresh meat wasn't an option, legally or illegally, peasants could always fall back on something a bit more mundane but still nutritious. Most peasants had access to milk through their village's communal cow. Yes, that was a thing. These community cows were like the medieval version of a coffee shop where everyone went to get their daily fix. Records from one English village show they managed to get about 2 to 3 gallons of milk per day from their shared cow, which had to be divided between 15 families. Talk about counting every drop. But fresh milk? That was considered strictly kid stuff. Adults drinking plain milk were seen as weird as wearing socks with sandals today. Why? Without refrigeration, milk went bad faster than gossip spreads in a small town. Instead, peasants turned it into cheese and butter, nature's way of making milk last longer. Cheese making was serious business. Archaeological digs have found special ceramic containers with holes in them, medieval cheese strainers. And what's funny is, these strainers were often inscribed with prayers. Apparently, medieval peasants knew that making cheese without it turning into a science experiment required divine intervention. Speaking of divine intervention, butter making had its own drama. The church actually banned butter during Lent in some regions. but not in others. This led to something historians call butter letters, actual official documents from the Pope giving permission to use butter during Lent. Some clever German peasants got around this by claiming butter wasn't food, but medicine. Doctor's orders, I have to eat this butter. The medieval peasants invented the ultimate cheese storage technique. They'd age their cheese in abandoned mines where the temperature stayed constant. Some of these cheese caves are still used today. Tests have shown that these caves maintain the perfect temperature and humidity for aging cheese. Those peasants knew what they were doing. But storing dairy products wasn't their only preservation challenge. The real trick was finding something safe to wash it all down with, because drinking water wasn't always the healthiest choice. Water in medieval times was about as trustworthy as a tax-dodging merchant. Rivers doubled as sewers, and wells were often contaminated with everything from animal waste to decomposing stuff you really don't want to know about. One medieval text actually warns that drinking water could turn your liver into a sponge. Not exactly scientific, but they weren't totally wrong about water being dangerous. Their alternative? Ale. Not the strong stuff we have today. Medieval ale was more like a slightly boozy smoothie with about 1% alcohol content. That's less alcohol than a ripe banana. Medieval peasants drank around a gallon of this weak ale per day. Archaeological evidence from medieval cesspits shows that nearly every household had their own ale-making equipment. The brewing process was usually handled by women, called alewives. These ladies were the original microbrewers, and some got pretty famous for their recipes. Court records show that some alewives even got into trouble for adding special ingredients to make their ale more popular. One especially entrepreneurial alewife was caught adding chicken droppings to make her ale foamy. Medieval quality control wasn't exactly FDA approved. Each village had an ale taster, possibly the best job title in history. These lucky folks had to sample everybody's brew to make sure it was good enough to sell. They had a special ale tasting cup called a tankard that had a whistle built into the bottom. When the cup was empty, you could blow the whistle to order another round. That's where we get the phrase, wet your whistle. Scientists recently recreated medieval ale recipes using archaeological evidence. They found that the brewing process inadvertently created a drink packed with vitamins and minerals. The ale was full of B vitamins from the grain, and the fermentation made these nutrients easier to absorb. Medieval peasants accidentally invented the first protein shake. And unlike modern protein shakes, this one came with a mild buzz. But drinking wasn't the only way medieval peasants got their daily nutrients. The countryside around them was like a free grocery store, if you knew where to look and what was safe to eat. Because foraging in medieval times was like playing a high-stakes game of guess what's edible? Get it right, dinner's served. Get it wrong, and you might be having your last meal. Archaeological studies of medieval teeth have revealed traces of over 40 different wild plants. These peasants were serious about their greens. Berries were the medieval version of fast food. Grab and go. Blackberries were so common that they show up in court records as landmarks. The murder happened by Ye Old Blackberry Bush was apparently a legitimate location description. Peasants even had special wooden containers designed just for berry picking, some of which have survived to today. They're basically medieval Tupperware. Mushroom hunting was particularly tricky. One medieval text lists mushrooms as being the devil's bread, probably because eating the wrong one could send you to meet him. But peasants developed clever ways to test mushrooms for safety. They'd put a silver spoon in the cooking pot. If it turned black, the mushrooms were poisonous. Not exactly foolproof, but better than nothing. Nuts were the medieval equivalent of protein bars. Archaeological digs have found massive piles of hazelnut shells near peasant homes. We're talking thousands of shells. One site in England had enough shells to suggest a single family ate about 40 pounds of hazelnuts per year. Medieval CrossFit, anyone? But it's interesting how peasants used herbs. They weren't just grabbing random plants. They had serious knowledge passed down through generations. Recent studies of medieval medical texts show that peasants knew about using garlic for infections and mint for upset stomachs. They were basically running a primitive pharmacy in their backyards. But foraging came with risks beyond just poisonous plants. Getting caught gathering wood or herbs in the Lord's forest could land you in serious trouble. One court record from 1320 shows a woman being fined for picking flowers on church property. Her defense? The Virgin Mary would want her church to look nice, so I was picking weeds. Nice try, medieval Karen. The best part about foraging was how it brought communities together. Kids would be taught which plants were safe from an early age, turning plant identification into a sort of medieval scout badge. Even today, some of the plants medieval peasants gathered, like dandelions and nettles, are making a comeback in fancy restaurants. Those peasants were just ahead of their time. And with all this clever foraging, inventive cooking, and resourceful food finding, medieval peasants proved one thing: they sure knew how to make the best of what they had.